What's up, guys? It's Jacob from TCG Buzz with a deck profile today. And as you saw from the title and thumbnail, I am showing you my long-awaited Godpunk deck profile. This is version 1 of the deck. My boy Brawlzeus, but I'm constantly working on this deck. I've been having more fun deck building and messing with this deck than any other deck in recent memory. So I'm constantly changing this, putting new cards in it, experimenting with some weird tech in. So if you guys want to see updates for this deck, let me know. I'm guaranteeing a week from now this deck will look totally different from how it does now. But I wanted to show you guys where I'm starting off, basically. So let's get right into it. All right, guys, let's get into the deck. So first, we have our Buddy. This is my Hydra. I don't necessarily have allegiance to Hydra. I'm kind of afraid Captain America, that was a terrible joke. I'm sorry. We've got this nice secret flag that I borrowed from Dalton. And by that, I mean I forgot to bring a flag, so he let me use his pretty one. So, we have, surprise, surprise, 4 copies of the Buddy. It's a good card. It lets you kill your opponent's gauge when it deals damage or destroys something, but it can also, if they're already out of gauge, force them to discard a card from their hand. And, it's a size 0, so that's important in this deck because you do run some size 3s. Next, we have 4 copies of the main man, the card that gains you all of your advantage in the deck. This card's ridiculous. His skill, it's not once per turn. So what ends up happening with him is you get to just gain gauge and draw like crazy. I've had turns where in combination with another card in the deck that recycles and a card that bounces, you can get his skill off 4, 5, 6, 12 times in a turn. So things get kind of nuts whenever he shows up. He does also give your opponent some gauge, which actually I know that's kind of counteractive to what you'd think in Buddyfight, but sometimes you need to give them gauge to get off your own skills. Probably my favorite card in the deck. Well, we'll see. Next, we have this card. I'm going to be honest. She's more of a sideboard card. She's good waifu. But mainly you'll want her for matchups where your opponent calls things from drop, because this just blocks that out completely. It's a really cool card. But again, more of sideboard material. She's more a placeholder right now. Then we have the card that scares everyone, even other Godpunk players, but everyone's terrified of him. He's the reason you play Godpunks. My man, Brawlzeus. So Brawlzeus destroys everything. He's so good. So his call cost is paying a gauge of your opponent's, paying one of your opponent's life, and removing a card from their field into the drop zone and that means it gets around a lot of effects, like this card cannot be destroyed. There's literally a book of rulings on how he works. Go read him for yourself. He also, on attack, when he deals damage or when he destroys something, you gain 2 life and deal 2 damage to the opponent. So he does have some plays once you've put him on the field, but mostly you're using him for that amazing removal. Next up, we have one of the cards I was talking about with the spamming of your resource gainer. This card does things. So she's a size 2, rest, pay a gauge, put 2. Oh, I actually have 3 copies. I forgot about the foil at the end. I was going to point that out. The big thing with it is you rest it, choose 2 from your drop that are of different sizes, return them. So you're returning your resource gainer and maybe a Brawlzeus or another card you need right now. It's just a great skill. And honestly, every archetype should have one of these. I really believe that. Next, we have one of the more interesting cards. This card shuffles your opponent's gauge back into the deck and gains you life. So the idea is if you're storming off with your combos with your advantage gainer and you've got your opponent at like 8 gauge, and you go, I need some of your gauge, but not that much. You can use this to reset their gauge back to 2. Then we have the Godpunk size 3. Just a really solid card. The thing is, when he's destroyed, your opponent loses a life and discards a card, and that's not once per turn, and he's got Soul Guard, so you can fill in the blanks on how that works. It's a really good turn 1 play to play him, because your opponent has to work around it the entire next turn, and they generally don't like destroying it, even though they have to. Then, this might be interesting to some of you guys. We have 4 copies of Basilisk Golem. It's a pot of greed on legs, guys. That's why you run it. This deck likes draw power, and sometimes he is bricky. I'm not intending to have 4 copies of him in the deck. He's going to probably go down to 2, but I'm missing 2 copies of another card we'll get to later, so he's a placeholder for that. He is really good, though, just because, sure, it's on battle phase that you actually get the draws, so you are filling up your field with him, but drawing 2 in this deck is very beneficial. Next, we have 1 copy of their good item, and even that's a stretch saying that. Godpunks don't really need items, and I'm seriously considering not running this at all. I know it's weird playing a Danger World deck with no items. I'm not quite used to it yet, but I honestly think that's where we're at. Or if you are running items, it's because you're splashing in like a Tyrant engine or something. Next, we have 4 copies of the deck Set Spell. This card is crazy, stupid good, and it is generic, so you'll see this not only in Godpunks, but in a ton of other Danger World decks. You set it, and then during your opponent's, at the beginning of your opponent's main phase, you choose to force them to discard a card from their hand and you draw 1, or you force them to lose a gauge and you gain 2 gauge. Just amazing. And it pays for itself in 1 turn activation, and you can keep it on the field as long as they're not destroying it, and it just keeps shredding their hand. And if your opponent ever gets down to just 1 card in hand and you have this on board, it's basically an instant GG. Next, we have 4 copies of the Godpunk specific Nullify. It does cost a gauge, which sometimes hurts, but you don't spend very much gauge in this deck at all, so it's not a big deal. So it's a gauge, and then you nullify an attack and you have to have a Godpunk, and then you gain a life and your opponent loses a life. It's just good value. Then we have 4 copies of one of your big playmakers in the deck. So this card, counter, pay a gauge, destroy a Godpunk on your field. Likely you want to target the size 3 who has abilities that work with his own destruction. And you choose 1, drop all souls from a card on the field, or destroy 2 monsters on your opponent's field. If you destroy 2, draw a card. Just really good card, and it is at counter timing, so you can also use it when your card would be destroyed anyways to destroy it yourself to gain some advantage. Next, we have 4 copies of one of the best cards, All Is Mine. All Is Mine is just an archetype searcher. It's a good card. Pay a gauge, search for a Godpunk monster, add it to hand. Done. Consistency. I like it because I've got really bad luck. So having something like this that just becomes any of your monsters when you need it is perfect. Next, some of you might see red when you see this card, but we have 3 copies of Obstruct because, no, you're not going to get to refill your hand after I force you to discard 4 cards. That's not happening. Sure, you might screw yourself over a little when you can't draw, but it's almost always worth it to play it when your opponent's going to draw something. My favorite time to use this, because you can only use it during your opponent's turn, is to use it right after you've activated your set spell to force your opponent to discard 1, then you draw 1, and then you go, oh, and by the way, now you can't draw anything. Then we have the card I'm missing copies of as of right now. That'll change later. 2 copies of the draw spell for Godpunks. You have to have a Godpunk in the field. Pay 2 gauge, draw 2, and your opponent discards 1. As soon as I have 2 more copies of this, the dual golem card that's a draw spell, basically, he's going to be bumped down to 2 because he is a little bricky. But out of the 7 or 8 boxes that we've opened in my play group, only 2 copies have been pulled. So I'm a little upset about that. We'll see what happens. Hopefully I can get more soon. And the last card, if those of you out there maybe are counting how many cards I've shown off because you're weirdos, the last card in the deck is Gambit. If you don't know why Gambit is a good card in this deck, I don't think you've been playing Buddyfight very long. It is so ridiculously good, and all of your skills are non-once per turn, so you can just keep spamming them. Spam, 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 spam. It's ridiculous. Unfortunately, you can only run the card at one because it is limited to one copy, thanks to the irregulars list, which does make me a little sad, because if I could run 4, I'd be running 4. So that's my deck right now. Like I said in the intro, this is only version number 1 of the deck. I'm planning on a whole bunch of playtesting and changes, and I mean, pretty much every day something in this deck has changed. So if you guys want to see some updates to the deck, let me know. Hit me up and be like, yo, Jacob, how's that Godpunk going? I'll be like, well, it turned into a dual golem deck somehow, or I added in 4 copies of loyalty for some reason, or whatever. So let me know if you guys want to see updates for this. Like this video, subscribe, hit that bell for notification. Let us know if there are any other new decks released in Ace that you'd like to see deck profiles of. Join our Discord to tell me that my deck sucks, or just to yell at me and rant about how Godpunks are terrible and I'm a terrible person for really liking them. And last, check out our Instagram. I think I'm going to take credit for this card right here, and I'm going to post a pretty picture of it on our Instagram. So that'll probably be up by the time you guys see this. So I will see you guys next time.